Hello, this is Pastor Manning, welcoming you to the Beacon of Hope podcast from Lighthouse Baptist Church at 2032 Cedar Hill Road. And I want to give you today a thought about the workings of faith in Moses' life. Moses is an amazing man, however you may look at him. If you look at him biblically, which of course would be the complete, full, and accurate way to look at him, he's an amazing man in that God used him to deliver the children of Israel from the Egyptians. A nation was birthed in a day, brought out of Egypt and made a separate nation in one day, and nothing like it had happened before. Nothing would happen like it again until Israel was reformed as a nation again after World War II. Moses was a man who was given the laws of God. He was the human penman to give God's words in the first 5 books of the Bible. He led a congregation of people, well over 1 million people, possibly as high as over 2 million people in the wilderness for 40 years. He was a lawgiver. He was an administrator. He was a prophet, and so much more. And however you look at him, he was a remarkable man. But the most remarkable thing about Moses was his faith. His mother and father had been people who had great faith in the living God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were in Egypt at a time when Pharaoh had ordered that when Hebrews had a man-child, that they were to throw the baby into the river, to kill that baby child. Don't think that's something that's fictitious. China, for many, many, many years, had a one-baby policy, and if a family was found they were going to have another child, they were forced to abort the other one, and abort is just another word for murdering. And that's the way it was in Egypt, as the Pharaoh would dictate that the children had to be murdered. But the parents of Moses didn't do that, but hid him for 3 months, and you know what they did? They put him in a little basket, an ark, if you will, of bulrushes, and put him in the river, in the edge of the river. And of course, the great account of what happened starts from there. But today, I want to give you the thoughts, and these 3 quick thoughts on the revealings of the working of faith in Moses' life. Not the faith of his mother and his father, but his faith and how it worked in his life. And of course, there's so much written about Moses and so much recorded about him and through him in the Bible that any study of Moses could be a lengthy one. However, in the book of Hebrews, there's a concise picture taken of the faith of Moses and what it meant to him and how it affected his life. I read to you those verses and then give you the observations. It's in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 24. It says, "By faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction, with the people of God." Remember, they were slaves at that time. "Rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ." To esteem is to count a value or give a value to. "Esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward." In other words, what he would be paid back and what would come from it. "By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, but for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Through faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them." These thoughts on this thing of the revealings of the workings of faith in Moses' life, I put down first of all that his faith affected who he wanted to be associated with. Moses' faith and real faith in the living God affected him and will affect who someone wants to be associated with. It says in verse 24, "By faith Moses, when he was come to years," in other words, he was a fully mature man, he was about 40 years of age, when he came to that decision in life, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose not to be associated with the path that would have taken him to wealth and position and safety and all these sort of things as far as the world could offer him. But he chose not to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather, so instead of that, to suffer affliction with the people of God. What happened was he changed his associations. He said, I would rather be accounted as one of God's people, no matter what their condition is in life. At that time they were slaves, rather than to be counted with the world that worships false gods and is going a false direction. So his faith affected who he wanted to be associated with. Does your faith affect who you want to be associated with? Are there any relationships that are affected because of your faith? Real faith affects relationships. Second of all, his faith affected his priorities and values. In verse 25 talks about esteeming. To esteem is what we put priority or value to. And it says esteeming the reproach of Christ. In other words, when he associated himself with God's people and through that with Christ, it would bring him a stigma. It would, oh, you're a Hebrew, that sort of a thing. Esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt. Wow, there were a lot of treasures in Egypt. A lot of very wonderful and pricey things there. He had access to all of them. And he said, well, rather than that, I would rather suffer with God's people, because he said, I have respect unto the recompense of the reward. He said, I know what's going to happen. You know, those treasure cities, the Ramses and such that were then at that time, they now are what are called ruins, ruins, ruins. In other words, they're places where people go to see the remnants and the artifacts and things which had been buried, which had to be dug up, of what used to be. But Moses today is with God in paradise. He chose something far greater, lasting. And then, not only our associations, but it affects our priorities and values. Does your faith in God, does your faith in Christ in particular affect your values? Do you value things and people differently than those who don't know Christ? Real faith affects values. And then his faith was based on seeing him who is invisible. That's what it said in verse 27. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured. How did Moses endure through all the many things he went through? He endured as seeing him who is invisible. How do you see him who's invisible? You don't see him with the fleshly eye. You see him with the eye of faith. You see his workings. You see his evidences. You see him, we can see him through his word, which Moses didn't have the written word, although the word was given to him to write, the first 5 books of the Bible. But we have a complete Bible. And we can see him and see his workings through history. We can see his evidence in creation. And we can see and we can endure as seeing him who is invisible. How did faith affect, and what were the workings of faith in Moses' life? Affected who he wanted to be associated with. It affected his priorities and his values, and it affected, and it was based on, rather, him seeing who is invisible. What effect does your faith have on your life? Real faith produces real effects. Selah, as the book of Psalms says. Stop and think about this.